There is a strange and deeply familiar attraction between the super empath and the dismissive avoidant. It feels almost like fate pulling two people together, yet the experience between them is often unstable and emotionally intense. The empath lives through feeling, sensing emotions with rare depth, loving without hesitation, and picking up emotional signals that others usually miss. The dismissive avoidant, in contrast, tends to love in a quieter way, keeping distance as a form of protection and fearing closeness even while secretly longing for it. When these two meet, a powerful emotional cycle begins. One person moves closer, trying to build connection and emotional safety, while the other instinctively steps back to regain space and control. On the surface, it looks like a mismatch in personality or emotional style. But beneath that, many experience something harder to explain, as if there is an invisible force holding the connection in place, even when both people feel overwhelmed by it. Some empaths report feeling the other person's presence or emotional energy, even in silence or absence. It feels like a bond that doesn't break easily, even without contact. At the same time, the avoidant may suppress or deny their emotional attachment, yet still find themselves returning when the empath begins to pull away. This repeating pattern feels intentional, but it is often driven by unconscious emotional conditioning rather than conscious choice. This is not a random connection. It is shaped by emotional wounds, attachment patterns, and deeply rooted psychological conditioning. The empath often carries a strong inner drive to understand, heal, and restore emotional balance in others. The avoidant carries a deep need to stay safe by avoiding emotional exposure. When these two patterns meet, they can create a cycle where one person overgives emotionally while the other withdraws further, even though both are emotionally affected. This is why the connection can feel both intoxicating and draining at the same time. Emotional intensity meets emotional distance. Deep vulnerability meets emotional control. Love begins to feel like both comfort and conflict. Over time, this dynamic can keep two people psychologically tied together, even after communication stops or logic says to move on. For many who experience this, the most confusing part is the inability to fully let go. Even when the relationship brings pain, there is still a pull that keeps the emotional connection alive internally. And just when detachment begins, the other person often reappears, restarting the cycle again. This creates the illusion of destiny or fate, when in reality, it is an activated attachment loop built through emotional reinforcement over time. A super empath is not simply someone who feels deeply. It is someone with an unusually high level of emotional sensitivity and intuitive perception. They do not just notice emotions in others, they often absorb them and experience them as if they are their own. This creates a powerful form of emotional awareness, but it can also blur boundaries between self and others. From a psychological perspective, this sensitivity is often developed early in life. Many super empaths grow up in environments where emotional safety was inconsistent. They learn to stay aware of moods, anticipate reactions, and maintain peace by adjusting themselves to others. Over time, this becomes a survival strategy, where emotional attunement replaces emotional security. As a result, they often develop a subconscious belief that love must be earned through care, understanding, or emotional support. This is what makes them especially drawn to emotionally distant partners. The dismissive avoidant becomes a symbolic challenge to their deepest emotional pattern, the belief that they must fix or earn love in order to be valued. Energetically and emotionally, super empaths tend to project warmth, understanding, and acceptance. To someone who has learned to suppress emotional needs, this can feel extremely comforting and even addictive. The avoidant may feel understood in a way they are not used to, which briefly lowers their emotional defenses. But at the same time, this closeness also triggers fear, because intimacy feels like a loss of control. This creates the push and pull dynamic. The empath gives more, trying to deepen the connection. The avoidant steps back, trying to restore emotional distance. The more one pursues connection, the more the other retreats. It becomes a repeating loop that neither person fully knows how to stop. For the super empath, this experience can feel overwhelming. They often sense emotional pain in others, even when it is unspoken. They forgive quickly, love deeply, and continue hoping for change, even when patterns remain the same. But without emotional boundaries, this depth of feeling can turn into exhaustion and emotional depletion. At the core, being a super empath is a powerful capacity. It is the ability to feel deeply, connect intensely, and understand others beyond surface-level interaction. But without balance, it can become self-sacrificing, where emotional energy is constantly directed outward while personal needs are ignored. The true growth for a super empath is not in trying to save or change others, but in learning to redirect that emotional awareness inward. Healing begins when the same depth of care given to others is finally turned toward the self. On the other side, the dismissive avoidant attachment style is often misunderstood. Outwardly, they may appear composed, independent, and emotionally unaffected. But internally, there is often a strong discomfort with vulnerability and emotional reliance on others. Their independence is not just preference, but a protective system built over time. This pattern usually begins in childhood experiences, where emotional expression was not met with consistent support. When emotional needs are ignored or rejected, a child learns that depending on others is unsafe. Over time, this develops into a belief system that prioritizes self-reliance and emotional control above connection. As adults, dismissive avoidants often rely heavily on logic, structure, and emotional distance to maintain stability. When relationships become too emotionally intense, their internal defense system activates. They may withdraw, shut down communication, or create space as a way to regain emotional equilibrium. It is not that they are incapable of feeling. Rather, they have learned to disconnect from feeling in order to avoid vulnerability. Common patterns include difficulty expressing affection, discomfort with emotional discussions, strong preference for independence, and an instinct to retreat when emotional closeness increases. In essence, self-protection becomes their identity, and intimacy, instead of feeling safe, is often interpreted as emotional risk. They tend to rely heavily on themselves, trusting their own judgment and instincts, but keeping other people at a distance when it comes to their emotional world. Control and withdrawal become their main ways of staying safe. When something feels emotionally threatening or overwhelming, their first response is to step back, reduce emotional exposure, or quietly downgrade the importance of the relationship in their mind. But underneath this calm and detached exterior, dismissive avoidants often carry unspoken emotional wounds. There is usually a quiet, unacknowledged desire for closeness and love, yet that desire remains buried under layers of fear. The fear is simple but powerful: getting hurt again. So even when they want connection, they may unconsciously create distance, pulling away from the very people who could offer genuine emotional intimacy. This is why it is important not to label them as cold or emotionally empty. Their distance is not a lack of feeling, it is a form of protection. It is an emotional armor built over time, often shaped by neglect, inconsistency, or emotional invalidation in earlier life experiences. That armor protects them from pain, but it also keeps them from receiving love in a safe and sustained way. This is where the connection between an empath and a dismissive avoidant becomes especially intense. Just when the empath starts to detach, reclaim their energy, or emotionally step back, the avoidant often reappears in their mind, dreams, or even real-life interactions. It feels like something invisible is still active between them, pulling attention back into the bond. This experience is often interpreted as coincidence or emotional obsession, but many describe it as a deeper form of energetic resonance. Every person carries a unique emotional and energetic imprint, shaped by thoughts, feelings, and lived experiences. When two people form a strong emotional bond, their internal states begin to influence each other in subtle ways, especially when one person is highly sensitive and the other is emotionally defensive. The empath typically operates from an open and receptive emotional state. Their energy flows outward, focused on connection, understanding, and emotional exchange. The dismissive avoidant, on the other hand, tends to operate from a contracted emotional state, where distance and self-protection take priority. This difference creates tension between expansion and withdrawal, connection and separation. When the avoidant pulls away, it creates emotional and psychological space that the empath instinctively feels. Because empaths are highly attuned to shifts in connection, they often experience that space as discomfort, longing, or unfinished emotional business. This can lead them to mentally or emotionally reach toward the other person, trying to restore the sense of connection that was lost. At the same time, when the empath withdraws or detaches, the avoidant may also feel the shift, even if they do not consciously understand it. The absence of emotional energy they were used to can create a subtle sense of imbalance, prompting them to re-engage just enough to restore familiarity and emotional equilibrium. This creates a repeating cycle. One person reaches, the other retreats. Then one detaches, and the other returns. Over time, this becomes an emotional pattern that feels powerful and difficult to break, not because of fate or mystery, but because of deep attachment conditioning and emotional reinforcement. From a psychological perspective, what feels like pull is often unresolved attachment activation. From a lived emotional perspective, it feels like longing that doesn't fully disappear. When both people are emotionally reactive to each other in this way, the connection can feel unusually strong, even when it is inconsistent or painful. The dynamic between a super empath and a dismissive avoidant often follows a very similar emotional rhythm. It begins with strong attraction. The empath is drawn to the avoidant's calm, mystery, and emotional restraint, sensing something deeper beneath the surface. The avoidant is drawn to the empath's warmth, acceptance, and emotional openness, which feels both comforting and slightly overwhelming. At first, there is a sense of balance, as if each person is filling something missing in the other. But as emotional closeness increases, the avoidant begins to feel exposed. Intimacy starts to feel like loss of control, and their internal protection system activates. They withdraw, become quieter, more distant, or emotionally unavailable. To the empath, this sudden shift feels like emotional loss or rejection. It creates confusion and emotional intensity, often leading them to try harder to reconnect. The more they reach, the more the avoidant pulls away, reinforcing the cycle of pursuit and distance. Then comes the reversal. When the empath finally steps back and begins to reclaim their emotional space, the dynamic shifts again. The avoidant, now sensing absence, feels that emotional gap and is often drawn back in. Not because of conscious decision, but because familiarity and emotional imprint are disrupted. This is how the cycle continues: closeness, withdrawal, pursuit, return. It repeats until awareness interrupts it. Not awareness of the other person, but awareness of self, of emotional boundaries, internal stability, and the ability to stay grounded without overextending or shutting down. The cycle is not proof of destiny or obsession. It is a reflection of two nervous systems responding to each other through learned emotional patterns. And it only begins to dissolve when one or both people learn to regulate their own emotional world instead of losing themselves inside the connection. When that happens, the magnetic storm slowly settles, and what remains is something closer to peace. Super empaths often don't see how their greatest strengths, compassion, loyalty, emotional intuition, can also become the very patterns that keep the avoidance cycle alive. Their instinct is to understand, to heal, to repair. So when the avoidant pulls away, the empath doesn't usually step back. Instead, the mind turns inward. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe if I try harder, love better, stay calmer, they will come closer. That inner dialogue quietly feeds the loop. Rather than creating space, the empath leans in even more, offering reassurance, patience, emotional presence, and deeper understanding. But to the dismissive avoidant, this can intensify the very fear they are trying to escape, the fear of being emotionally consumed, overwhelmed, or controlled. So they retreat further. Then the empath experiences that withdrawal as rejection and often unconsciously turns it into a challenge, something to fix, something to win back. The effort increases, the emotional investment deepens, and the cycle tightens. Another hidden pattern is emotional over-responsibility. The empath starts carrying not just their own emotions, but the avoidance wounds as well. They feel what the other person cannot express and silently try to heal it through love. But in doing so, boundaries dissolve. Emotional energy blends, and over time, the empath feels drained, confused, and disconnected from themselves. These patterns persist because, beneath everything, there is often a quiet fear of abandonment. Love begins to feel like something that must be maintained through effort, sacrifice, or endurance. Breaking this pattern requires a very different understanding of love, one that does not chase, rescue, or prove itself, but instead allows space and respects emotional distance without self-abandonment. That is where healing truly begins. When a dismissive avoidant returns after pulling away, it rarely happens by accident. It is usually triggered by internal shifts that are not fully conscious. Even though they present as detached, avoidants are still deeply wired for connection. They simply struggle with the vulnerability that comes with it. So when emotional closeness is removed, something inside them registers the absence. The moment the empath stops reaching, stops explaining, stops waiting, stops chasing, something changes in the emotional field between them. The absence becomes noticeable. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel strangely quiet. And in that quiet, memory returns. They begin to remember the warmth, the acceptance, the emotional safety they experienced with the empath. Not as a clear thought, but as a feeling of contrast. Something is missing, and that missing feeling creates movement back toward the source of comfort. This return is often not fully intentional. It is instinctive. The avoidant is drawn back toward emotional familiarity, not necessarily because they are ready to change, but because the internal imbalance feels unresolved. The silence of the empath becomes noticeable precisely because it replaces the emotional energy they had grown used to. In truth, what draws them back is often the unhealed part of them that still associates the empath with safety. But lasting change only happens when that return meets something different: boundaries, emotional clarity, and self-respect that no longer repeats the old dynamic. Breaking free from this cycle requires more than physical or emotional distance. It requires inner reorganization. The empath must begin to reclaim their emotional energy from the dynamic itself. Every time they over-explain, over-give, or wait in silence hoping for change, they are extending their energy outward into uncertainty. The first shift is learning containment. Not shutting down love, but redirecting it inward. Choosing to feel without spilling, to care without carrying, to understand without absorbing. Boundaries are not rejection, they are structure. They define where you end and where someone else begins. A boundary is not, "I will not love you." It is, "I will not lose myself in loving you." Alongside this comes energetic and emotional cleansing, letting go of what does not belong to you. This can happen through reflection, writing, stillness, time in nature, or simply noticing when your emotions are not entirely your own. The goal is separation. Your feelings, their feelings. Your responsibility, their responsibility. When this shift happens, the emotional charge begins to fade. The cycle loses its intensity. The push and pull stops feeling like gravity and starts feeling like a pattern you can finally see clearly. Healing as a super empath is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about becoming more rooted. Your empathy is not the problem. Unanchored empathy is. When your emotional depth is grounded in self-respect, it stops pulling you into chaos and starts guiding you toward clarity. True healing begins when love is no longer confused with self-abandonment. When you stop proving your worth through emotional endurance. When you begin to treat your own inner world with the same care you once reserved only for others. Many of these patterns begin long before adult relationships. They often trace back to early experiences where love felt conditional, where emotional safety had to be earned, or where you became the one who held everything together. Without realizing it, those early roles can repeat in adult relationships, drawing you toward familiar emotional dynamics. Healing means meeting those younger emotional parts with awareness instead of repetition. It means rewriting the internal belief that says love must be earned through sacrifice. A deeper truth slowly replaces it. I can be loved without disappearing into someone else's emotional world. From there, relationships begin to change. You stop over-giving. You stop overextending. You begin to love with presence instead of depletion. And you naturally start to attract connections that feel stable, reciprocal, and emotionally consistent, rather than intense but unstable. The empath-avoidant bond is rarely simple. It is intense, reflective, and deeply revealing. It shows the empath where compassion turns into self-erasure. And it shows the avoidant what emotional safety could look like if they stayed present long enough to receive it. This passage is pointing to a deeper shift in how emotional patterns, especially the anxious avoidant or empath dismissive dynamic, are meant to be understood. At its core, it is saying that these painful relationship cycles are not happening just to hurt you or confuse you. Instead, they often act like emotional mirrors. Every time the other person withdraws, goes silent, or comes back again, it triggers something inside you that forces attention inward. Not toward them, but toward your own emotional foundation. The idea is that these experiences repeatedly highlight one central issue: where you are placing your sense of stability. When someone becomes inconsistent, emotionally distant, or unpredictable, your nervous system naturally starts searching for certainty in them. You start trying to fix the distance, understand their behavior, or regain closeness so that you can feel safe again. But the passage is suggesting that this is the real turning point. When you realize that stability cannot be built inside someone else's emotional availability. If your peace depends on whether another person is present, open, or responsive, then your emotional world will always feel unstable. So instead of continuing to chase consistency from the outside, the focus shifts inward. You begin to rebuild that sense of safety within yourself. This doesn't mean you stop caring or stop loving. It means you stop abandoning your own needs, instincts, and emotional boundaries just to maintain connection. When it says, reconnecting with your body, your boundaries, your voice, and your peace, it is pointing to self-awareness in real time. Your body tells you when something feels unsafe or draining. Your boundaries define what you can and cannot tolerate emotionally. Your voice represents your truth instead of silence or self-suppression. And your peace becomes something you protect instead of sacrifice. At this stage, your responses change. You no longer say yes out of fear of losing someone, and you no longer say no with guilt or over-explaining. Your emotional decisions become clearer, calmer, and less dependent on how the other person reacts. As this internal shift happens, the emotional cycle between you and the other person naturally loses intensity. The push and pull begins to weaken because you are no longer feeding it with over-involvement, overthinking, or emotional chasing. The dynamic stops feeling like something you are trapped inside and starts feeling like something you can observe from a distance. The passage also reframes what healthy love actually feels like. It says, real love does not feel like pursuit. That means you are not constantly trying to catch, convince, or secure someone's attention. Instead, real love feels like emotional safety, mutual effort, consistency, and presence without anxiety or confusion. When you reach a point where your self-worth is no longer dependent on someone else choosing you, something important changes internally. You stop revolving around uncertainty. You stop reorganizing your emotions based on someone else's behavior. You become emotionally steady, even if the relationship is not. That is what anchoring into your own worth means. It is not arrogance or emotional detachment. It is inner stability. You know who you are, what you need, and what you will no longer lose yourself for. And from that place, the pattern breaks. Not through force, arguments, or emotional struggle, but through something quieter: self-return. Self-return means you stop leaving yourself to maintain connection. You no longer disappear emotionally just to keep someone close. You no longer overextend just to avoid being left. You come back to yourself first, every time. So the final idea is simple but powerful. The end of the cycle is not about changing the other person. It is about no longer losing yourself inside the dynamic. And when that happens, you are no longer someone waiting to be chosen. You become someone who already stays with themselves, no matter what.